I think the market's wrong on Green Bay. So Jaden Reed has been a pretty hard fade for me at his cost. The legendary cold open. I've heard so much about this. Was I supposed to prep anything?
No, it's funny. When I had Alfredo on, it was the same kind of reaction of like, man, this is what the cold open's like.
Yeah, it's fun. And Alfredo and we started doing it earlier in this offseason as well, because we would always, StreamYard takes some time to kind of like warm up. It always cuts off and muddies those first few seconds. So we were having some really fun conversations before the show, and we said, why not make this a part of the show? And it has just gotten like more and more off the wall every single episode.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of cold opens, and we do it with Becoming a Bestball Bro. Rich, Ryan, and I will just talk about some random thing to open up the show and have like sometimes like a one-liner or whatever. And like, I mean, it's gotten to the point now, like we're 10 episodes into Becoming a Bestball Bro within the series. We just talked about pooping ourselves the last episode. So we've gone from, talking pretty high level generic stuff to very detailed things about our lives just through the cold open. I think it's a way to really get intimate with the audience.
Yeah, about 4 or 5 episodes ago, we started our show off with me belching into the microphone and saying, "Oh, that spindrift is going down a little weird," and they get fun.
Man, I was thinking because obviously this will be on YouTube for folks to watch. This isn't the first time you've been on my YouTube channel, because a couple weeks ago I was doing a live stream, Bestball Mania draft, and you were in the same draft as me. I believe you were in the back end of the first round, and you ended up getting AJ Brown, I think, maybe in that draft. I think it was. I didn't even tell you. Look, we do a lot of best ball. How deep are you in these best ball streets this year?
I've got a little over 300 done total, 77 done in BBM, so a little over halfway through that. The one thing I do remember about that draft is that I drafted a naked CJ Stroud, which I don't normally do.
Yes, that's right.
And he's a guy that I don't have a lot of exposure to, but he fell like almost 2 rounds below ADP. And I guess it wasn't like completely naked. I don't know what you'd call this, like maybe scantily clad CJ Stroud, because I did have Joe Mixon, so I got a little bit there, but then I had to I got sniped on Dalton Schultz, so I went with the very rare CJ Stroud, Joe Mixon, Noah Brown stack, which was a lot of fun.
You just need those wide receivers to not be playing in week 15 through 17, and you'll be good to go. And we'll see what the backup situation ends up looking like and how it comes to fruition. But yeah, I mean, like, I'm on number, I think 84, 85. So we're pacing around the same. Are you planning on max entering BBM?
I am, yeah. And I've done a little bit more every year. Like my first year playing best ball, I did a handful of BBM drafts. Year 2, I did like 25. Last year I did 80 something. And then this is going to be my first year actually max entering. So hoping for some good results there.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I feel that. So, well, speaking of you as an analyst, as a drafter, I always ask this question to open up perspectives, or at least I frequently do. How would you describe yourself as an analyst? Like, what's your process look like? Do you lean into the analytics a whole lot? I mean, I kind of know the answer. We've done plenty of shows together and we've talked to each other plenty. But are you like, how would you, Dave, describe yourself?
That's a good question. And I'll be a little vulnerable here because that's a big insecurity I have. I feel like a lot of people in the industry are like a former scout, somebody who really knows how to study film. And then you've got other guys who like yourself, like you're a data analyst and you can pour through these huge sets of numbers and come to some conclusions there. I don't really find myself on either end of that spectrum, but what I've tried to do is just learn more every single year. Like I constantly try to, talk with guys like you, talk with guys like Matt Waldman, talk with guys like Graham Barfield that help me just kind of expand my knowledge of the game a little bit. So I've always considered myself to have a pretty deep understanding of just the NFL in general. And I think that's kind of where my edge comes from, understanding schemes and coaching tendencies and trying to predict where usage is going to go. So when I first got into the industry, I've been playing fantasy football for a long time now. I've been playing for about 25 years, started creating content back in 2017. And I used to be a hardlined like film guy. Like that was all I cared about was watching the games. And I still watch all of the games, and that's where my process starts. But over the years, I've become much more open to using numbers. And I don't have a numbers first approach, but a lot of times when I have a hunch from watching games, I will go to the numbers, and the numbers either prove what I believe to be true, or a lot of times it disproves. I'll have a hunch and then I look at the numbers and say, well, I'm totally wrong there. Like an example, Cooper Kupp. Last year I watched him and I thought, well, Cooper Kupp is washed. I don't want anything to do with him. Then I start digging into the numbers and I say, wait. You look at the games that he was healthy, he was actually still Cooper Kupp, even with Puka Nacua there. And then I kind of have to change my stance a little bit.
Yeah.
So I always start by watching the games like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays. That's what I'm doing in season. And then after I kind of confirm how I feel about something, then I hope that the numbers are going to back it up.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Did you play football or anything, or like where did the love for the game come from for you?
I played through high school, but I was terrible. I was not a good football player. I was a little undersized. My main sport was volleyball. As a lefty,
Okay.
I was able to play that right side front row, and that's where I excelled in sports. So I played a little bit, but I started playing fantasy football when I was really, really young. And I'm talking like, pre-internet days. I'd be sitting in the living room with my dad. He was the commissioner of his league, and I'd be helping him in the mornings. He'd be getting calls from his friends with their Sunday morning lineups. And that's when I got into it. And I really wanted to play. And the first year I played was in 2000. He had just moved from paper to playing online, and played in a Yahoo league when I was 10 years old, and I was hooked. And then I was in high school a few years later, started a league with my buddies that's still going to this day. So I've just always been a big football fan. Being from Chicago, football is just kind of a part of our DNA there. My grandpa tells the story all the time, but when he handed my mom over on the morning of her wedding, he looked my dad in the eyes and said, "Remember, footballs are for Sunday." I mean, it's something I don't really have a choice in. Football has always been a part of what we do.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh. It's the same deal in Pittsburgh, where it's just a part of who you are and how you're raised. I mean, to the point where, I know that people are going to think this is crazy because I haven't really been as like on podcasts and stuff. I'm not sitting here being like super pro Steelers or like rah about the Steelers. And I'm not really the same kind of fan that I used to be per se, but I still have like the symbolism of what the terrible Tau is not just about football per se, but it's also about the city of Pittsburgh. And, I live in Charlotte now. My daughter was born in Charlotte, but when she was born, and there's a picture, I believe, on Twitter when she was born, almost 6 years ago to the day. But there's a picture of her, as a newborn in the hospital, and I draped the terrible Tau over her, as like a christening almost of you are now part of not just Steeler Nation, but you have that Pittsburgh blood in you. It's just the way that it is in a lot of those Midwestern cities, man. I mean, it's a very, very important part of the DNA of those cities.
And conversely, you kind of see why like Los Angeles struggles to get big fan bases, and Florida struggles with that. I think there's something to be like being in the Midwest, being in the Northeast. There's nothing else to do in the winter. Like you just sit around. It's freezing. Like you go outside, it hurts your skin, so you're going to sit inside and you're going to watch football all winter.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's when you get people in Buffalo putting themselves through tables and such, because there's nothing else to do but to get drunk and watch some football. Which nothing wrong with that. I'm not talking down on that. It's just that's the truth about the weather and the climate in these areas. So like I said, you've done a lot of best ball drafts. You're 77 plus or almost into the 80s with Best Ball Mania. You've drafted hundreds of teams at this point, but we're at a point in time where July is ending, and we know when July ends and August begins, we start to get a lot of more casual players and season-long players and managed season-long players. I say season-long. I mean, I think that we've sort of, grouped these two. It's best ball as a thing, even though it is technically kind of season-long because it's only the 1 year that we're looking at. But season-long, I'm referring to managed leagues that we're actually setting lineups, playing the waiver wire, the traditional fantasy football, setup, right? I think that we're going to see some crazy takes potentially, and some crazy analysis and all of the above because of what Underdog's ADP looks like and what the strategy of Underdog best ball drafts look like versus what we might see in our home leagues and in these season-long managed leagues. So my question to you is, how do our brains need to shift as we move from all this best ball content, this best ball way of thinking, and which we still will be thinking that way throughout August, to be clear. But as we get into more of these managed season-long leagues, how should our brain shift? And what do you think are going to be the biggest differences from one setup and one format to the next?
Well, you're probably not going to see 20 wide receivers going in the first 2 rounds of your
Yeah,
home league.
probably
I
not.
mean, this wide receiver avalanche, as people have been calling it, I think that's going to be pretty specific to best ball. If you took best ball ADP right now and like plug that into sleeper and a bunch of casual drafters started drafting, you'd see running backs going way, way earlier. And I think
Yeah.
we're even going to see that shift in best ball as more casual players start plugging in, and you're already going to see that a little bit. So running backs are going to go earlier. Quarterbacks and tight ends are, of course, going to go later. But I think the biggest thing too is looking at some of the players that have very wide ranges of outcomes. I'd expect them to go a little bit later in your home leagues. Like right now, Marvin Harrison at the 1-2 turn. I don't think that's going to be happening in your home league, but when you're playing in a pool with 670,000 plus people, you need to swing for that high end range of outcomes.
Yeah.
So Devon Achan, Drake London, Jaden Reed, Anthony Richardson, these guys that are getting steamed up right now in best ball probably are going to be a little bit more affordable in your home leagues because you're playing against a pool of 11 people as opposed to 670,000. I also think some of these boring players are a little bit, more desirable in managed leagues. There's some guys that project for workload that you probably aren't crazy about in best ball, but I think they serve a purpose in a smaller field. Zamir White, Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris, Devin Singletary. These guys aren't going to give you, like 30-point weeks, but they do project to give you a reliable floor. And I think that that's somewhat useful. And then, of course, because you also have waivers to fall back on, I'm kind of looking at these guys as potential placeholders. I probably don't want to be starting Devin Singletary in week 14 or week 15 of my home league. But if I can draft him and then pick up somebody off of waivers and kind of use him as a placeholder, I think that that serves a purpose. You don't get that same benefit. So I think one, the guys with the wide range of outcomes are going to go a little bit later. And two, I think in home leagues, I'm more willing to draft those boring RB2s and RB3s that I find myself overlooking in best ball.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, and it makes a lot of sense. I have a theory that I haven't necessarily thrown out there totally, but I've obviously talked about like the running back dead zone plenty and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What if underdog ADP, and I say this as someone who gets criticized sometimes from patrons, etc., for having too wide receiver heavy rankings, right? Mm-hmm. I do rankings for 1 quarterback, 2 running back, 3 wide receiver, 1 flex, 1 tight end, and that's going to, affect the way that I draft wide receivers. I'm going to push them a little bit higher. And then if you only need 2 wide receivers that you're starting, you push them down a little bit, etc., etc. But I have a theory that what if underdog's ADP is just right? Like, what if underdog's ADP is actually the way that people should be drafting, but it's just that when you then layer that on top of a home league or, a managed season-long league, you end up seeing these running backs going earlier, to your point, like Rachaad White is going to go from, you can get Rachaad White at the end of the 6th round in best ball drafts pretty frequently, right? Rachaad White will be a 3rd round pick in your home league, right? But what if the way that we're valuing Rachaad White on Underdog and in Best Ball is actually the way that we should be valuing Rachaad White in our season-long leagues? Like, if I look at my rankings and I compare my rankings to what's going to go on in home leagues and then my rankings to Underdog, right? So I take my redraft rankings and I run them through a formula and they get altered for Underdog specifically. And then I post that CSV so that people can upload them themselves. But that's based on, okay, we got to bump up wide receiver, you got to make sure that we're making all these changes. But I almost have thought, or I haven't almost thought, I have thought about what if you just took Underdog's ADP to your home league draft? Like, do you think that's viable in some instances, or do you think that you would walk away from that draft without any running backs and you would not really know what to do at that position, and it would be way, way too wide receiver heavy?
I think that would be it. I think that if you drafted off of underdog ADP in a home sleeper league, you're going to end up not taking your first running back until like the 10th or 12th round.
Yeah,
and I think that's kind of the fear there. So you have to play ADP to some extent. Now, Fredo Brown, we just had this discussion on our show a couple of days ago. I don't look at ADP as kind of a guiding factor for where I want to draft players, but it does help you kind of get an idea of where your league mates are going to be drafting players. And I think you have to play that somewhat. That being said, when we start seeing these guys move up, like Rachaad White at a 3rd round pick, there's no chance I'm clicking that button.
Right.
Derrick Henry probably is going to fall to like the 1-2 turn in home leagues. And as you know, I think Derrick Henry is pretty reasonably priced right now on Underdog, but if he's going at the 1-2 turn, I'm completely out on that price. So I think that naturally by doing all of these Underdog drafts, when you do plug into your home leagues, you're almost assuredly going to end up taking a zero wide or zero running back approach because of the sticker shock on the running back ADPs. So I don't know if you can say that like you can draft 100% off of underdog ADP, because like I said, you're probably not ending up with a running back until at least the 10th round or so. I think you have to reach for at least one or two running backs early, so you're not playing too far behind at that position. But I think that when I compare underdog ADP to a lot of other platform ADPs, I think where they do have it right is in the positional rankings. And it's crazy to me. And I'm not going to call out any format specifically, but I've looked on some platforms where like Hollywood Brown is going as like the wide receiver 42. Like that is crazy to me. Like he should be going much higher than that. So I think the way you can do is kind of look at the positional rankings on underdog as a good indicator of where people should be going. But once you start blending positions together, then it gets really murky.
Yeah, 100%. I honestly think that you could find great values by just looking even at consensus rankings on like a Fantasy Pros or something and comparing those positional rankings to underdog and seeing the differences. And honestly, the biggest delta, because in my draft guide, the way that I find values is I just use Fantasy Pros expert consensus so that I can say, this is what your league is probably drafting off of. So here's who I'm higher and lower on. And, I'm not putting my rankings on there, but I can at least kind of tell people, where I'm higher or lower on guys. I can tell you definitively the position or the types of players that will rank a lot higher on underdog in my rankings, and I'm assuming in your rankings too, because yours will be influenced to some degree by all the best ball drafts that you've been doing. It's with rookies. Rookies get pushed up way higher, and rightfully so. All of the research that I've done has suggested that rookies in redraft are always massively undervalued. Like every single year, even the early round guys. But people get fixated on the Bijan Robinson of last year and these guys who don't necessarily pan out to the degree in which we thought that they would pan out. But man, every single year, it's not just the late round guys. And what's so interesting is that the market dynamics, you see none of these rookies get drafted as high as they should up until like the double digit rounds. And then once the double digit rounds hit, that's when we start to see so many rookie wide receivers fly off the board and so many rookie running backs fly off the board. And it just shows you that the rooms are scared. They're scared to draft the uncertainty, but that seems to be the place. That's a common theme throughout all my draft guides is lean into that variance, lean into that uncertainty. Because, man, if a dude is getting drafted in the 5th round of a season-long league and he's a rookie, he's probably pretty freaking good at football because he hasn't even stepped foot on a football field yet.
Do you think we've gone a little bit too far? And sorry to just like completely flip the script and ask you a question, but do you think we've gone too far with like Marvin Harrison where he's going? A lot of times he's going off the board in the 1st round. Or Malik Nabers, very good talent, but, quarterback concerns, offensive surrounding concerns going in round 2 and 3. I agree with you. In years past, we were getting just a couple of years ago, Garrett Wilson was going in like round 4 or 5 of underdog drafts. And now we're looking at guys who are similar prospects going in rounds 1 and 2. Do you think there's still value to be had there with those rookies, or have we maybe gone a little bit too far?
I think you could argue for sure that we've gone too far, but on the flip side, I think that you have to look at the market right now and what the positions look like right now and what the position looks like a wide receiver in particular. So it's going to be a wide receiver heavy draft, right? Over on underdog. Like what's going to happen, and you have to force it to some degree as a result of that. Because if you just go 3 or 4 straight running backs to start your draft, sure, anything can work out, but you're probably going to be hurting a wide receiver. Right. You better draft 10 wide receivers on your team, right? And so because it's got to be wide receiver heavy, you're going to go wide receiver. Now, if you look at what's going on in that 2nd round, to me, there's just a lot of variability anyway with those wide receivers in that range. I like a Chris Olave, sure, but I understand the direction where it could go south. I love Jalen Waddle, sure, but I understand why maybe the ceiling wouldn't be there. Or I love, a Drake London, let's say. I don't necessarily love any of these. I'm just giving you examples, but you can see the downside for all of those players. And so I think the reason why it's okay to get a Harrison or a Nabers is simply because of what the rest of that draft and what your alternatives kind of look like in those ranges. I actually think that, I said this from this like earlier this offseason, especially when Nabers was like a firm 4th rounder, like
one of the easiest picks in drafts at that point.
Right. It was so easy because the opportunity cost was totally different. I do think that now he's probably just properly priced on underdog. I think that if you look at where he goes on underdog though, and I'm talking even positional ranks versus where he's ranked by other analysts and other platforms and such, he will be a screaming value whenever you overlay those 2 ranking sheets. And I think that's the the big difference and the big key is that I'd say that finally, I haven't played as much volume as I am this year on Underdog, but I've obviously played in the past plenty. I've drafted over 100 teams each year and stuff. And last year I think I was at like 250 or so. But this year is like, okay, I'm going to be over the 500 mark pretty comfortably. Yeah. And so I'm much more keen in what's going on and understanding what's going on. But I would say that in the past, every year it seems like drafters have gotten on Underdog have gotten more okay with drafting rookies earlier and earlier. And this year, I think they just got it right. Like, I think that where the rookies are going it's generally right. Like, I don't have necessarily like crazy exposure to any of the rookie wide receivers, but I also have exposure to the rookie wide receivers, which tells me that they're probably being picked up in the right spots in general on that particular platform.
And you need to, because like Marvin Harrison, if the stars align, could be a top 3 receiver. And
that's
that
right.
Upside is there. And, back to like the first question you asked, kind of like, how do you see yourself as an analyst? When I first started, I felt like I needed a take on every single player. Like every single player needed to be either overvalued or undervalued. And I was writing an article 2 off seasons ago, and I was writing an article on Kyle Pitts, who was one of the most polarizing players in fantasy that offseason. And I was trying so hard to come to a definitive take that he's either overvalued or undervalued. And I went to Joe Bryant and I said, I can't come up with a take. I think the market is right. Like where he's getting drafted is tight end 6. It's got the upside and it's got the downside, and it's all kind of right. I think the market is just right here. And Joe said, well, then write that article. Say that the market is right on Kyle Pitts. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that is something that a lot of people struggle with early on, is just saying like, this guy's accurately priced. You don't have to say every player is either overvalued or undervalued.
Yeah, I actually think that most players are probably properly valued. Like it's, going into a season, obviously we'll look at after the season and say, wow, we're morons. But, entering the season, like I don't need to take strong stances. That's part of like people, people definitely are turned off by it from my perspective and like how I handle things. But I think it's pretty natural to say, hey, look, the market's getting this right. I'm going to give you the pros and the cons. Sure. You can make your decision on your own because that's what this is all about. But I don't necessarily have a strong take. I don't have a Dalton Kincaid. I have no strong take on Dalton Kincaid. Like I just,
he's a great value where he's at. Like, and there's upside and there's downside. Yeah.
Like I can see I see it differently with a guy like Trey McBride versus a Dalton Kincaid. If you're gonna say, hey, who do you like more between these guys? Then I can give you an answer. But if you're saying, is Dalton Kincaid properly valued? Sure. Like I don't need to have a strong opinion on every single guy. I think that's a normal, rational reaction. Is definitely, to your point, it's a really, really important thing, I think, for everyone in the fantasy industry to come to a conclusion of and realize, because, it's why we see Twitter be the way that it is, with just the takes flying all over the place all the time,
Twitter is very much a necessary evil. It's fun to throw the takes out there, but when you're on a show talking about these things, you could be much more nuanced. And that's something I try to do a lot with these polarizing players, is like, here's the upside case, here's the downside case. Sometimes I'm just right in the middle, and sometimes I lean a little bit in either direction. But I think that it's kind of important in our job to just give as much information as possible to the audience and help them come to an educated choice.
This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played over at Underdog yet, now's the perfect time. There are tons of different best ball leagues that you can join, and there's definitely a league out there that fits what you're looking for. And you can use all the things that I've talked about with guests on Becoming a Best Ball Bro to crush those drafts. But like I said, now's the right time to join up. Because if you go and you sign up and use promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a nice deposit offer, but you also get a free late round draft guide. That's a $25 guide emailed to your inbox after signing up for absolutely free. So head to underdogfantasy.com, sign up using promo code LATEROUND, and make a deposit. I can confirm it's a really, really fun platform to play on. Now back to the show. Is there a draft slot this year that you think is best? Because this is a question I get constantly all the time. Is there like a range that you want to be in a snake draft, or do you just not care?
So my redraft rankings my season long rankings are a little bit different than best ball. Like in best ball, I have to, with the amount of drafts that we're doing, when you're doing hundreds and hundreds of drafts, you don't want to take really strong stances in the early rounds, because, God forbid you take a strong stance on Amon-Ra St. Brown, he gets hurt week 1, and then you've just nuked your portfolio. So I think that you kind of need to let the players just kind of fall to you in the early rounds. But in season long, where I'm not doing quite as many drafts, that's where I'm okay switching up my rankings a little bit. So my rankings are going to differ a little bit from what you're seeing on Underdog, but for me, my top 5 is pretty clear cut, where I've got Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I want one of those top 5 picks. One, I think that those guys are just a tier above the next guys. Now I'm okay if I get the next tier, which I have, 4 guys: AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson. I think those guys are very similar, but the big issue for me, it's not even so much what you're getting in round 1. It's what you're getting in the next 2 rounds. Like when I look at round 2, it is so flat. We've already talked about a lot of these guys, the names that we threw out there, Chris Olave and Drake London. I think they're fine picks where they're going, but I don't see a huge difference between Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, Drake London, Devontae Adams, and the guys you're getting at the end of round 2, where you're getting Jalen Waddle, Brandon Ayuk, Mike Evans. They all feel like similar players. So, what usually if you're picking at the end of round 1, you're getting a better player in round 2. And I just don't see that happening this year. But then even once you get deeper into the draft in round 3, I think there's a pretty big fall off about halfway through the 3rd round.
Yeah.
If you're picking early in round 3, you're getting Cooper Kupp, or if you want to get Derrick Henry or DK Metcalf, you can do that. When you get to the end of round 3, you're looking at some pretty shaky players there. And that's when you start maybe reaching for a Sam Laporta or a Josh Allen or something like that. So not only if you're picking early in round 1, you're one, getting a higher tier of players in round 1. 2, I think you're getting similar players in round 2 than the guys that are drafting late in round 1. And then 3, I think there's a pretty big tier fall off in the middle of round 3. So I absolutely want an early pick this year. But that's what we said last year too. And the best pick you could have had to start your draft was CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So who knows? Maybe we can be proved wrong this year too.
Yeah, I agree though. I mean, anytime I get the 112 in a draft, I hate it so much. Because at least like at the 110, and again, this is more of a best ball thing because we haven't done many season long drafts and managed league drafts yet. But, if you get like the 110 or something like that, sometimes in the 3rd round, you'll get a falling value, right? Like sometimes like a random play, maybe a Malik Nabers or something will fall to that range and then you feel good, or like a DK Metcalf, whatever. But it rarely happens at the turn. And then you're forcing, players, and you're drafting players, and you're forcing things too because you're at the turn and you're trying to read the rest of the board a little bit. Mm-hmm. It's just a really difficult place to be. And I've looked at season long ADP, and I think it's relatively the same. I would say though, if you're in a league that is going to be running back heavy and such, you might be more okay at the turn and in the late first, just because those running backs are going to push some of those wide receiver values down. And like we talked about earlier, we're probably not going to take Rachaad White in the 3rd round. Other folks in your league will maybe take a Rachaad White and a Josh Jacobs and a Joe Mixon. And then that's going to force these really good wide receivers
at the end of round 3. And you feel pretty good about that. Yeah,
exactly. So I do think it'll be a little bit dependent on that. But if your drafts are going to be fairly sharp, which I think is sharp, my opinion of what's sharp, if that's the case, then that back half of the first is going to be probably pretty rough for teams this year.
It's just such a cliche, but like you need to know the ADP of the platform you're drafting on. And like we've got it, footballguys.com/ADP. We kind of blend ADP from a bunch of different sites together. But like I'm looking right now, and the way guys are valued differently on different platforms is crazy. Like Nico Collins right now, if you look on Drafters, which is a Bestball platform, he's going 16th overall. And then you look on MFL and he's going 40th overall. So like that's a huge difference. Like, are you taking him at the top of round 2 or are you taking him in the middle of round 4? It's really important to know how the ADP looks. Like I said, you're going to draft off of the rankings that you have, whether they're from you or from me or from Football Guys or Fantasy Pros, wherever you get your rankings from. But ADP does help you kind of get an idea of where your league mates are going to be drafting players. So like you might want to take Nico Collins at the top of round 2, but if you're drafting on MFL, you could probably wait until round 3 and he'll still be there.
Yeah. And I said this in my draft guide, but the players who you think you need are not always the players that you think you need. So if you do miss out on Nico Collins in that instance and you force it a little bit, it's not the end of the world. There's other alternatives. You don't know if he's going to have a monster season or not. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. Well, let's talk about Nico a little bit. Let's talk about the wide receiving group in Houston. We have these offenses. Chicago's one where you got Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and DJ Moore. Houston, obviously, Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell. And then Green Bay, too, you could even say, with just this hodgepodge of, they're not as elite. Yeah. They're not as elite as what you're seeing in Chicago and Houston. But, you can make a case for a lot of the wide receivers in Green Bay, at least having the ceiling and having the potential to be, really good wide receivers in the league. So my question to you is, if you're looking at a managed season long league, are you going to be going after some of these wide receivers on these teams, or are you saving your exposure to those guys to only best ball drafts because you know that, if they do have a down week, which is possible, there could be just a lot of variation, there's someone else that can step in and kind of fill that role?
So, I talked about it at the top of the show. I said, like, one of the things that I think I'm pretty good at predicting is kind of, coaching tendencies and where the ball is going to go and usage for players and stuff like that. So I try to look at all of these situations independently, and just recently did a series with Jeff Bell where we dug deep into every single team depth chart and kind of predicting where we expect the usage to go and how we expect base personnel to look like and things like that. So I think each of these teams I'm looking at through a very different lens. Like with Chicago, DJ Moore is really the only guy I'm interested in here. And I understand like Keenan Allen coming off a big season. Rome Odunze is a great prospect. But the concerning thing here is you look at Shane Waldron, he's not a guy that has typically deployed a lot of 3 wide receiver sets. And I don't know if it's going to be Keenan Allen or Rome Odunze that's on the field on the bench during these 2 wide receiver sets. What I do know with, I don't want to say certainty, but I don't expect DJ Moore to come off the field. So he's the guy that I'm willing to draft, just knowing that he's probably going to have a 100% route participation. He's not going anywhere. And we've also seen, during his time, whether it was last year with Justin Fields or during his time in Carolina, he's pretty much quarterback proof. Houston is one where I think all of these guys are just a little bit too expensive. I'm okay drafting Nico Collins at cost, but the prices of all of these guys just outright scare me a little bit with how high that they're going. Diggs is the guy that I have almost no interest in, an aging receiver going to a new team, downtrending production over the last couple of years. Nico is the guy that I'm okay paying up for, but that's one that I'm just kind of fading all around. And I know it's crazy because Houston's going to be a great offense, but it scares me not knowing where those targets are going to be distributed. Green Bay is the one that I think is the most interesting. And JJ, we've done shows in the past. I used to have you on the launch pad every offseason, and we would talk about these ambiguous wide receiver rooms and ambiguous running back rooms and try to talk about, who we liked best at cost. And you said something that stuck with me where you said, with these ambiguous situations, I think the market typically gets it right. I think the market's wrong on Green Bay. And that's the one that I just keep going back to. Jayden Reed last year was a 50 to 60% snap player. He was only playing out of the slot in 3 wide receiver sets. Now we're drafting him to be the wide receiver 1. And I think this is just a classic case of getting enamored by the young guy. We've got some of the touchdown cologne as well from his rookie season. So Jayden Reed has been a pretty hard fade for me at his cost. And I find myself liking Watson. And then Dubs is a guy that I'm not crazy about, but I think he's going to be on the field a lot. He's just a guy who does the things that don't show up on Player Profiler and don't show up in the stat sheet, but he's a good blocker and he can move the chains and he's sure-handed and he might not pull an elite target share. He might not have the flashy efficiency metrics, but he's a good football player and that matters. It's a lot like Alan Lazard's role over the last couple of years in Green Bay. Wasn't flashy, didn't put up a ton of stats, but he was almost always on the field. So that's kind of where I'm concerned is Reed was the exciting guy as a rookie and people are drafting him as the wide receiver 1. But I don't know if he's got the skill set to be an outside receiver and play on 2 wide receiver sets.
Yeah, I think it's super valid. My one thing too with these groups is I do think that in managed season long leagues, I'm going to be less inclined to grab one of them and be enthusiastic about grabbing one of them because I do think that, there is going to be a volatility factor. Maybe their points per game look okay by the end of the year, but I don't know if their points per game is going to necessarily match where they're getting drafted, by season's end. And the only way that they would then see an increase in points per game or match what we need from their ADP in terms of points per game would be via an injury, right? Like Jayden Reed, but I will say now flipping to best ball, I'm okay in going that direction than in best ball because in best ball, you obviously are going to capture their spiked weeks, right? Like if they have a monster game, which I do think that we'll see a roller coaster as long as all these guys are healthy of, DJ Moore going off probably more frequently than Keenan Allen, probably more frequently than Rome Odunze, but each of them might have their own day, right? Their own week where they have a 2 touchdown game and they have, 120 yards and 7 catches or something. And when they don't do that, you have the backup of, 7 other wide receivers potentially getting into your starting lineup and giving you that production. And then on top of that, you obviously have the injury upside, which the injury upside exists in both season long and in best ball, but it's just, a different beast whenever you're talking best ball, just because that the ceiling outcomes are out of control there, and you're not having to worry about the floor outcomes nearly as much. So I do agree. I think the Green Bay situation is one that is very, very difficult to discern, as you're kind of talking about here with Romeo Doubs, especially like in spreadsheets in particular. I'd say that of the 4 wide receivers that we're talking about, Romeo Doubs is probably the least attractive one, right? Like he saw a lot of good red zone work, was scoring touchdowns down the stretch, especially when Jordan Love started coming on board and doing well. But, from a yards per route run standpoint, you had 2 rookies in Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed get over that 2.0 mark, which is not an easy thing to do for a rookie wide receiver. Christian Watson obviously has that crazy week in, week out upside where there might be some volatility, but he at least has that. Romeo Doubs is like, all right, yeah, like he's a solid player. I just don't know how special the dude is, right? But again, we're doing 2 things here, man. We're trying to evaluate these players ourselves, and we're trying to evaluate how the team might be thinking about these guys.
Exactly.
And so in your opinion, you're saying you think the team likes Romeo Doubs enough. Let me just ask you this. Do you see there just being a 4-man rotation without an injury in Green Bay?
It could be. And I think, we joked about this on a show months ago. Bo Melton is another guy who saw his role growing towards the end of the season. We might see a 5-man rotation. And we haven't even mentioned Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, who are both good pass catchers as well. I mean, this is one of those situations where I think the smart thing is just to fade Jaden Reed, who's the most expensive, and throw darts on the cheaper guys. And I'm throwing darts at the tight ends. I'm throwing darts at Dontavian Wicks. It was much nicer drafting Dontavian Wicks as a 17th round player before everybody got in on Dontavian Wicks. And I think you might be partially to blame for that, JJ. You've really got him steamed up there. But I think that's the approach that I want to take with Green Bay. I want to invest in this offense, but I don't want to pay a 4th round pick to invest in this passing offense. I'd rather throw darts later, knowing that all of these guys are going to have big spike weeks. And I think that you're right, that we could see a pretty steady rotation here. Like, I don't think that they're going to say, wow, Dontavian Wicks was great as a rookie, but, he's going to need an injury to get on the field. I think we're going to see him coming in for Romeo Doubs. We're going to see him coming in for Christian Watson. We know LaFleur is a very smart coach that likes to get his players on the field and keep them fresh. So, we're going to see Musgrave lining up out of the slot. We're going to see a lot of creative usage here. I think all of these guys are going to be involved. I just want cheap parts of the offense, especially in best ball, where I don't have to worry about plugging them into my lineup.
I'll ask one last question about Green Bay. Cost aside, who do you think is the most talented, could be an alpha, could emerge and just be that dude in that offense?
That's a tough question. And I think it's Christian Watson. And I had some concerns about Christian Watson coming into the league. He played at a small school, didn't have a ton of production, was a pretty raw player coming into the league. And I think that he's limited in what he can do. He's going to catch balls near the red zone, and he's going to catch deep passes, and he can't do much outside of that. But especially from fantasy, like that's what we want to see. Like he's going to score touchdowns and he's going to have big plays. So I think if we're asking like who is the best all around wide receiver, it might actually be Jaden Reed, just with what he can do after the catch. But I worry about his ability to play outside. And I think that's kind of the concern with Jaden Reed, is that he might be stuck primarily in a slot role. So I think the most alluring for fantasy is Christian Watson because of the big play upside. But I think the best all-around football player actually is Jaden Reed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Part of the reason why Jaden Reed in best ball on Underdog is easier to pass on is because there are tight ends that will often fall into that range. Whether it is a Trey McBride or a Mark Andrews, McBride usually goes a little bit earlier, but sometimes he falls. Mark Andrews will fall often. Dalton Kincaid, the guy that we talked about earlier. My question to you is, do you think that tight ends right now are mispriced at the top? And are there any favorites that you're getting among those tight ends?
I try to leave every single draft with a top 8 tight end. And the top 8, for people who aren't aware, Kelsey, Andrews, Laporta, Kincaid, Pitts, Kittle, McBride, Ingram. I want one of those 8 guys because all of those guys have, a tight end 1 finish in the range of outcomes. Like they can all finish as the overall tight end 1. And the way that I listed them is how I have them ranked. I think we've probably seen the ceiling for Ingram, tight end 2 overall last year. But all of these guys are guys that I want. After you get past that, you're throwing darts at some guys, and we see it every year where guys drafted outside of the top 10 finish inside the top 5, and it's probably going to happen this year. But there's just been such a huge change in the tight end landscape. Like, it used to be that you'd reach for Kelsey because he would give you a massive positional advantage. Well, then Mark Andrews showed up on the scene. And then TJ Hawkinson was traded to Minnesota and he broke out. And then Evan Ingram went to Jacksonville and broke out. Then we got this influx of young guys with Laporta and Kincaid and McBride. And now all of a sudden Kyle Pitts has a quarterback. And now I don't think it's that you're drafting these guys for a positional advantage, but I think that if you miss out on one of these top 8, you're at a huge positional disadvantage. And like, sure, maybe Noah Fant breaks out, or maybe Tyler Conklin breaks out. Like, we always see these guys that we don't really expect, but I think that you're getting security with these top 8 guys. And if you don't have one of them every single week, you're just playing from behind, hoping to close that gap against your opponent who probably does have one of these top 8 guys.
Yeah, and speaking of the positional advantage that you get from those players, I think that we would all push our chips in and say the biggest advantage you're going to get at tight end is going to come from one of these 8 players this year. Right? Like more than, and if you look at history, I did this in the draft guide. If you look at history and you look at the top 3, I looked at top 3 and then tight end 4 to 6 and then tight end 7 to 9 and so on. So in groups of 3. But if you look at those groupings by ADP and look at how they perform versus the rest of the position, top 3 tight ends and then top 4 to 6 tight ends is kind of its own tier as well. But top 3 tight ends, not only are they ranked in the top 3, but they generally finish very, very well versus the rest of the position does. And I even removed Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelce from the data set.
Totally skew the data.
Yeah, because you knew that they would skew the data. Even the other guys that get drafted in that range really do outperform the rest of the position by a really high rate, which makes me believe that those guys should probably be drafted a little bit higher. Now, maybe the tight end 1 to tight end 3 this year is a little bit closer to the tight end 4 to tight end 6 historically than what we've seen historically, right? Because like there is this larger tier-ish of players that you can look at and get. But yeah, I mean, like, to me, and I'm not usually an early tight end guy, but you know, in your home leagues, all of their ADPs are lower than what we've seen over the last decade. Like every single tight end spot until you get to like tight end, you know, around tight end 7, tight end 8, all of the ADPs are lower. And so you're getting a discount. And to me, it's based on this perception of, you know, tight ends last year at the top were not very strong. You know, Travis Kelce, who's still, Kelce finishes
the per game tight end 1.
I know. Yeah. He's still the tight end 1 in points per game. And people were like, oh yeah, he had a bad year, which based on ADP, I don't necessarily disagree, but it's so crazy that people were saying that he had this bad year despite finishing as the tight end 1 in points per game. And then at the same time, you had, you know, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, and all these guys, Jake Ferguson, all these guys emerged from the late rounds. And I think that just, you know, more subjectively and feel-based, you know, the later rounds are a little bit more difficult this year. Last year, it was cake. Last year, you can look at my draft guide, both Laporta and Ferguson were highlighted as late round dart throws. This year, some of the late round dart throws at tight end are Jonnu Smith. And it's like, I don't think it's a bad play given the market, but I do think that there is not nearly as much upside with a Jonnu Smith versus what we had in a Sam Laporta or a Dalton Kincaid or Jake Ferguson last year. So where are you at with some of these late round tight ends? Are there any that you're going after? Because obviously if you get one early, in best ball in particular, if you get one early, you're going to pair them with someone later more than likely. So who are some of those guys?
Well, a few things. First of all, you talk about how like you in the past haven't been in on early tight ends. Well, the early tight ends last year were costing you a first round pick. Like if you wanted Travis Kelce, you were using a first round pick. If you wanted Mark Andrews, you were using a second round pick. Now the top guys are still going in round 4. So I don't even know if you can say like early round tight end because they've all been so suppressed in value. Yeah. And the one last thing I'll say, you know, you talk about how flat it was at the top 3 at the position historically. You just look back at last year, you take out the game where Mark Andrews got injured. Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson, and Mark Andrews averaged exactly 14.6 PPR points per game. Like they had the same exact output. So we've seen that historically, but we saw it, you know, just as early as last year. But for the late round guys, I am going to talk about Jonnu Smith after we just kind of dogged Jonnu Smith a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk about
the difference is like the best case scenario for Jonnu Smith is what you're getting 8-9 points per game. I think the upside with Jonnu Smith, especially in best ball, is that he could have the spike weeks. He could rip off a 60-yard touchdown and give you those, you know, week winning upside. So I like Jonnu Smith there. Another guy that I really like is Isaiah Likely. Last year when Mark Andrews went down, you were pretty much getting like 1-to-1 production from Isaiah Likely. Now, this again, kind of talking about coaching tendencies and scheme changes. We didn't see it a lot last year in Baltimore, but what I want to see this year, you look at the depth chart, they don't have a deep wide receiver room. Like it's Zay Flowers and then just a bunch of guys. And we know that Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely both have the elasticity to play in the slot or to play tight ends. And then you look back at what Todd Monken did when he was in Georgia. His base personnel there was a 2 tight end set. So this would be a change in philosophy from what we saw the Ravens doing last year. But I'm kind of a believer in, and like David Njoku is a guy that I'm drafting because I'm a believer that like when the cat's out of the bag, the cat's out of the bag. And I think they saw Isaiah Likely last year could be a consistent contributor. So of course, when you're drafting Isaiah Likely, I think the thesis is, well, he's got contingent upside. We're kind of drafting him as a tight end handcuff. But I think there is potentially some standalone value where he could just be a full-time player even without an injury, because you look at the other receivers there, and sure, like we can wish cast Rashad Bateman again, but I think that we could see kind of their top 4 receivers being Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, and Isaiah Likely. So he's a guy I like. TJ Hawkinson is another guy that I'm drafting. Not a lot, because I'm certainly scared off by the injury, but he's one of those guys where if I do miss out on one of the top 8 guys, then TJ Hawkinson becomes a priority for me. He's got a lot of red flags, getting up there in age, late season injury. Not even that he's old, but once you're over 25, it takes longer to heal. Yeah. And then, of course, the rookie quarterback, or if it's Sam Darnold, whatever it may be, there are red flags there. But if I miss out on a top 8 guy, I'm okay drafting TJ Hawkinson just because I do need the upside, and he is going to likely give you more upside than anybody else. Then the last guy is Luke Musgrave. We've already talked about the Packers a little bit, but he was a good prospect. He's on a good offense, struggled with injuries as a rookie. But again, if I'm trying to buy into the Packers offense and I don't want to pay up for the premium guys, Luke Musgrave is a guy I can get late in drafts that hopefully has some upside.
Yeah, Musgrave is someone that I called out in my draft guide because he fits a lot of market trends that I look for in a late tight end breakout or late round tight end breakout, where he's younger in age, he was a good prospect, but also he has a climbable depth chart. Now, as much as we're saying Green Bay has good wide receivers, which I do think they have good wide receivers, we have to think about all these different scenarios that could go down in Green Bay, and one of them is, what if all these wide receivers are like 15% target share guys? Or like, what if Dontavian Wicks is a 12 to 15% guy, Romeo Doubs is a 15% guy, Watson and Reed are 18% guys? Luke Musgrave could be a 15 to 20% target share guy, and that's all you need for him to be a legitimate starter. Then obviously there's the contingent upside of injury as well. So I like those picks a lot. And the Musgrave one I just had to call out because he does fit a lot of the historical market trends. But he's really, there's not a ton of guys that fit those market trends this year. It is going to be a rougher late round tight end season, I believe.
Are you in on Ben Sinnott? Because he was another guy that I was drafting a ton, but he has just moved so high up in drafts that I find it really tough to click the button on Sinnott. And I want to be in on him. I'm warming up. I want to be ahead of the curve. And we've seen it over the last few years where tight ends are hitting the field as rookies and producing. So I used to have like a no rookie tight end rule. And I was in on Sinnott, but then he just jumped a couple of rounds, and now I struggle to draft him.
So I'm not as high. I wasn't as high on him as a prospect as others were. Like, I thought he was a really good prospect, but not this like really great prospect that some people kind of build him as, right? Which is fine. Like, no one's right now. I have no idea if I'm going to be right or wrong about that. That's just what my model was saying. But then on top of that, I don't think Zach Ertz is going to necessarily go away. And that's part of my fear.
He held Trey McBride at bay for a year and a half.
Yeah, right. And so if Zach Ertz is used, I do think that, McLaurin's obviously a strong enough one to get 20 to 25% of the team's targets. Jahan Dotson might be able to get something in that offense. Luke McCaffrey, I think, is a solid slot guy who could get some work. And so, like, you break it down in what should be at least not totally friendly passing offense. I don't think it's like going to be horrific, but it's a rookie quarterback. It's a mobile quarterback. I do think they'll run with decent pace because of Cliff Kingsbury, but yeah, I mean, like, I've really just gotten him in stacks, if I'm being honest. Like, I haven't gone on my way to get Sinnott. Part of that too, I mean, his cost has fallen a little bit, making it a little bit easier. But there was that spike immediately, especially after the draft, where he was going at like tight end 18, like not even far off of like Luke Musgrave, which to me, a guy like Musgrave just made a lot more sense. All right, let's talk about running back. This is he's going to be one of the most polarizing players, I think, of this fantasy football season, if he isn't already. But Kyren Williams, you got one side who says Blake Corum doesn't matter. Kyren Williams is going to smash again this year. You got the other side that says Blake Corum does matter. Don't draft Kyren Williams at ADP, which, by the way, in your season-long leagues and your managed leagues, he's not going to go in the mid-third round like you see in best ball. He's going to be a second-round pick, more maybe even a first-round pick in some. So where do you stand with Kyren Williams? Which side of the debate do you land?
I'm just going to give you the most boring politician answer possible. I think that Kyren Williams is perfectly valued where he is. I checked my exposure before we did this show to see, and I'm at 9.2%. So basically exactly average on Kyren Williams where he's going. If he moves into round 2 in managed leagues, I'm probably going to be out on him. But like I said, giving you the politician answer, I'm just going to completely spin off of Kyren Williams, who I think is perfectly valued, and say that I think Blake Corum is extremely undervalued. And he's a guy that I'm aggressively targeting later in drafts. And I think that there's this idea that if you're in on Blake Corum, you must hate Kyren Williams and vice versa. But I think Kyren Williams is a fine value. I just think that Blake Corum is going way later than he should be. And it's because there's multiple outs for Blake Corum. One, we have this idea that Sean McVay is just going to lean on one running back because he's done that historically. But what if he does just commit to a split backfield here? Kyren Williams struggled with a big workload last year, picked up multiple injuries. And yeah, we've seen McVay has always leaned on one guy, but what if those injuries piling up do change his philosophy a little bit? And all of a sudden, Blake Corum gets the goal line work in a really good Rams offense. And then all of a sudden, Blake Corum pays off even without an injury to Kyren Williams. Of course, there's the contingent upside where Kyren Williams gets hurt. And then we're looking at Sean McVay leaning on Blake Corum in this coveted RB1 role for the Rams. Or there's also the very unlikely outcome that Corum just steals the job. He's bigger, he's younger, he's stronger, he's got the burst. He doesn't have the same injury history. Of course he had the knee injury, but he doesn't have these minor injuries piling up. So I think there's a lot of outs for Corum to really exceed his ADP. But with Kyren Williams, I understand why he's a polarizing player. The bull argument, he was a top 2 running back last year. His coach loves leaning on a running back. He got all the high value touches last year in the passing game and near the goal line. And then the bear argument, he's undersized, he's relatively unathletic, he doesn't have the draft capital, he's been hurt, and Blake Corum is there. So this is one of those where I said, I can present the upside and the downside and just say that I'm kind of in the middle and think that drafters have this one right. But even though I'm drafting Kyren Williams, Blake Corum, regardless of who I've drafted in the early rounds, works as somebody that I'm trying to fit in just about any build.
Yeah, I agree. I have a lot more Corum than Kyren because the investment in I think it's a totally different investment in Dynasty versus redraft also, right? Yeah. Dynasty is a different, you're going to spend more to get Corum hypothetically because of age and yada, yada, yada. But as a later round dart throw, he's going to probably go even later in managed leagues and season long leagues, within the position at least. It's an easier dart throw because, like you said, there's a lot of outs. And I also want to talk about, because one of my favorite things that I like to do in fantasy football is take a talking point that, whether or not it's valid or not, I just want to see if it's valid, right? And ask questions to see the validity of that talking point. One of my favorite ones was back in the day when people would say that Kyle Shanahan fed his ex-receivers. And it's okay, well, let's layer on top the personnel a little bit and see that he had Julio Jones, Andre Johnson. He had some very, very good ex-receivers throughout his career. Of course, he's going to feed them, right? My question, or not even question, but the way my brain has been thinking about this, and I want to get your thoughts on it, because a lot of people would say this with Mike Tomlin, right? Mike Tomlin loves a bell cow back until he doesn't, right? Last year, we obviously didn't see Najee Harris be the bell cow that, we thought that he would be, or that people have historically projected a Mike Tomlin running back to be. Sean McVay, yes, he's had bell cows in the past, but my pushback to the idea, and I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong here. This is literally me just thinking out loud and how I've been thinking about this. Last year when Kyren Williams went down, what happened to that backfield? That backfield was a split backfield. They had Royce Freeman, Darrell Henderson, right? I mean, I think they sprinkled in Ronnie Rivers a little bit until he was hurt, but they had a split backfield without Kyren Williams last year. And so the response to that would be, well, yeah, that's because those guys aren't very good running backs and they're obviously not going to command a really, really big workload. But I think that's kind of the point too, right? Because what if Blake Corum is talented enough to push Kyron Williams and get some of that work, right? I don't think that that's like an unreasonable thing to think after the guy had a pretty good collegiate career, was a really solid prospect, day 2 pick. I think if you put Blake Corum next to Kyron Williams as prospects, you would probably say that Blake Corum is the better prospect compared to Kyron Williams, right? Now, Kyron has last season under his belt, so we would never say that Blake Corum's a better running back than Kyron Williams. I think that's kind of irresponsible. But I do think that there's at least a little bit of, what if they're okay with a split backfield when they have the right competition in that backfield? Like last year, the competition was right, but it was bad, right? It was Royce Freeman, Darrell Henderson. This year, you're looking at Kyron Williams, and what if they say Blake Corum is good enough? So I don't know. I've been more on the I'm out on Kyron. I've gotten him randomly in best ball just because I don't want to have zero exposure, because that's frightening, because we know the upside is there. But I do think it just makes me lean into Blake Corum a little bit more, way more than I thought I would, because Kyron Williams had a good year last year. Like, this isn't a situation where, I'm sticking to, he was a mediocre prospect who got very lucky in the year that he saw a lot of volume and broke out. I really think he was a good player last year, and I really think the Rams like him. But if you look at all of their actions and what they've done, Kyron Williams gets hurt. They know they lack depth at running back. What do? They go out in the draft and they get a dude who is probably the most Kyron Williams-like back in the entire draft class this year, Like, to me, a lot of it is just signaling Kyron Williams is still going to see a lot of work, but I just don't know if his workload is going to allow him to hit the ceiling that we wanted to hit, whereas Blake Corum, to me, might be being drafted at his projection right now. And if he's being drafted at his projection, we know that can go north if there's an injury to Kyron Williams.
Right. And that's why when I talked about like the multiple outs, I let off with saying like, what if McVay does split this backfield up a little bit? Because we know McVay's a good coach, and good coaches are going to change their tendencies to fit their personnel. And I don't think that they, accidentally drafted Blake Corum. I think it was a very intentional move for them to go out and get a guy who could shoulder the load. And Kyron Williams, like you said, he was a good running back last year, and early in the season, he wasn't great. Like, his rushing yards over expectation on a per game basis for the first 2 months of the season was terrible. And then he just consistently got better and better each week. So I think he earned the job, and he's going to get, first crack at the starting job. But like I said, good coaches will change their philosophies. And I think that we could see that happen here. But, you talk last about how there was kind of a split backfield when they didn't have Kyron Williams last year. But what jumps out to me is in years past where we didn't see McVay do that. There was a few weeks where Malcolm Brown was getting a workhorse role. And Darrell Henderson for 12 weeks was averaging 18 touches per game in 2021.
It's fair. Yeah.
But I think last year is when we saw that little bit of a change in philosophy from McVay. So that's kind of the easiest out to picture in 2024 is that McVay says, well, I've done this in years past and it hasn't worked out well. Like feeding Malcolm Brown and feeding CJ Anderson and feeding Darrell Henderson
and Todd Gurley. Look what happened to Todd Gurley.
Todd Gurley.
But I mean, the end of Todd Gurley's career went the way that it went, right? Where if you're a coach and you played, I don't want to say you played a role in Todd Gurley's career ending, but if you played a role in Gurley seeing the amount of work that he saw, which could have led to injury, right? That might change your philosophy. Like, I don't know. Part of the coaching and usage stuff, I think is really important to look at, especially when it's like schematically makes sense, right? Like when it really matches what they do. Like if a coach runs a lot of 12 personnel, or like Arthur Smith, you look at his offenses, super tight end heavy offenses, right? So you generally know that there's at least a chance that something favorable could happen with Pat Freiermuth this year, right? Because the offenses are tight end friendly, right? But when we're talking about, the tendencies of like a backfield and handing the ball off or using a guy in a certain role, when, McVay's sample size isn't that small anymore. I get it. But in terms of like the backfield rotations that we've seen out of LA, it was the Todd Gurley era. And then there was a gap for a little bit. And then it's the Kyron Williams era, right? And
who else did they have last year? Like Zach Evans, they
that's
clearly
what I'm saying.
Didn't want him. Ronnie Rivers was terrible. They were bringing in Royce Freeman off the street. So I think that the workload we saw for Kyron Williams last year was because they didn't have anybody else, and now they clearly do.
Right, and I think that at the very least, everyone should entertain the idea that changes Kyron Williams' workload. right? Like that. Like if you're drafting Kyron Williams as if this is not going to do much at all to his, I think that's wrong, right? Like I think that you have to factor in the variance in the way that these coaches might be thinking a little bit differently about these guys. That's really what it comes down to. Anyway, let's move on to one more running back. Another fairly controversial one, Derrick Henry. I don't think as controversial, but where are you at with Henry and his fit within this Baltimore offense?
I do like the fit, and there's so much, we talk about how like these Konami code quarterbacks end up kind of vulturing touches away from running backs, but that's never really been the case in Baltimore. Like you look at Josh Allen, when they get within the 5-yard line, he's taking a snap out of the shotgun, he's finding the lane, and he's just plowing his way into the end zone. Of course, Jalen Hurts as the tush push, but what we've seen pretty much Lamar Jackson's entire career is that he's going to take the ball under center and turn around and give the ball to his running back. And like, that's what we want for Derrick Henry. But man, it's impossible to ignore the downtrending efficiency. Of course, we've seen smart guys like ourselves, JJ, like we have identified this downtrending efficiency for years and just continue to have egg all over our face every year.
I am the last person that anyone wants to talk to about Derrick Henry, for sure.
But I get it. Like you look at everything, like there isn't a metric out there that he hasn't trended down in since 2020. Yards after contact, rushing yards over expectation, broken tackle rate, yards per attempt. And you could even, you don't even have to look at the efficiency stuff. You could just look at his overall volume and his overall production. They have all been trending down for 4 straight seasons. So I think with Derrick Henry, again, this is one where I'm just going to kind of cop out and say that I think he's kind of appropriately priced because it's obvious that Derrick Henry could be a landmine, going into his age 30 season on a new offense. It's possible that Derrick Henry just goes for 800 yards and 4 touchdowns this year, and the usage finally catches up to him. But the other side of the story is that he can go for 22 touchdowns this year in Baltimore. And I think that there's so much upside with Derrick Henry in this offense, knowing how they operate near the goal line, that you kind of have to draft some Derrick Henry just in case we're wrong. But he's not a guy that I'm like aggressively clamoring for either. Huge range of outcomes for where he's going, but Derrick Henry could easily be a top 5 running back in this offense. So I think that you kind of have to draft him here and there because of where he's going, and you don't want to miss out on that upside. But if I'm just doing one league, like that's it. If I'm just playing one fantasy football league, I'm probably not even thinking about taking Derrick Henry until the 4th or 5th round, which means that I'm probably not getting Derrick Henry. But when you're drafting volume, I think that you kind of have to sprinkle some Derrick Henry in.
Yeah, he's going to go pretty early in home leagues this year, I would imagine, just because of name brand and people being excited about him being in Baltimore, which I think is all valid. Maybe name brand aside, I think that the situation is really valid, especially because he's never been a pass catching back, and that doesn't really matter in an offense like Baltimore's. That's not where the value really comes, for a running back in that Baltimore offense. So I agree. I'm basically at market with Henry. I'm not playing that game this year. Maybe people will see that as a cop out, but I understand, both sides of the spectrum with Henry. As you laid out, I would agree with you entirely. Now, you haven't had a strong take with Kyron or Derrick Henry. So tell me, Dave, who are the guys that you think are dramatically undervalued right now?
All right, I'll stick with the running back since we're talking about running backs. And JJ, you came in on our show, the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show, a few months ago, and we did a show about guys who are undervalued. And at that point in time, I said Jonathan Brooks was undervalued, and his ADP hasn't really changed. So I am still drafting Jonathan Brooks. I keep waiting for his ADP to go up, and it just hasn't. But clear RB1 of this class, even despite coming off of an ACL tear last year. And you just look at the situation there. Miles Sanders was terrible. Chuba Hubbard was, basically average. I don't know if you can say anything outside of average for what Chuba Hubbard did last year. But I get excited about this Panthers offense as a whole. And maybe I am just sipping the Kool-Aid too much, but you look at the offensive line improvements, you look at bringing in Deontay Johnson and Xavier Legette. Now they suddenly have a formidable passing attack. But really, it's Dave Canales, the guy that we've seen resuscitate Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield in back-to-back seasons. I have faith that he can bring out some better play from Bryce Young. And what it comes down to is just Jonathan Taylor being a good running back, though. Logged a breakaway run on 43% of his rushes in college. And then he also catches a ton of passes. The only running back last year that had more yards per route run was Travion Henderson, who's probably going to be the RB1 in this class. So this guy is a great rusher, a great pass catcher, and he's on an offense that I expect to be a little bit better. Now, the one other thing I'll say about Jonathan Brooks, and I hesitate to make this comparison because Todd Gurley was an elite prospect, went top 10 in the draft, but
Sure.
Todd Gurley tore his ACL in almost the same exact timeline that Jonathan Brooks tore his ACL. It both happened in early November, and Todd Gurley was kind of eased into his role as a rookie, didn't do a ton, but still finished the year as a top 12 running back.
Yeah.
But what excites me most is that during the fantasy playoffs, the weeks that we're really hoping to get these big spike weeks from, Todd Gurley, as a rookie coming off of an ACL tear, averaged 19.9 points per game. So that's kind of the thesis that I have with Jonathan Brooks is, he might not be a guy that you're plugging in week one as an RB1, but I expect his role to grow as the season progresses. And I'm hoping that you can draft him in the 8th or 9th round and get RB1 production over the second half of the season.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And Dave Canales too, is someone who gave Rachaad White a massive bell cow workload last year. I don't think he's afraid to do that as long as Jonathan Brooks is healthy, of course.
And that's the fear. I mean, he's already on NFI, and when I saw that hit, I was like, cool, I'm going to get him for even cheaper.
Yeah, exactly.
His ADP hasn't budged. Like, I think people kind of anticipated that move ahead of time, but Jonathan Brooks is a guy, dynasty, best ball, redraft. I'm just a big fan of the talent, trying to get him wherever I can.
Yeah. What about an overvalued player that you're not that into drafting this year?
This feels sacrilegious to say, but Davante Adams is a guy that I'm just really struggling to hit the draft button on this year. I know you've done a lot of studies on age curves, and once you get 32 and older is a tough year, or a tough age for wide receivers. And of course, we see the outliers, the Anquan Boldens and the Steve Smiths and the Larry Fitzgeralds. They're out there, but over the last 10 years, we've only seen 6 wide receivers above age 31 record 1,000+ yards. And of course, one of them last year was Adam Thielen. So it's possible, but I just get a little bit concerned. We're seeing the downtrend, and Dwayne McFarland just did a really cool study on age curves and said that, he doesn't expect to see Davante Adams just fall off the age cliff. Receivers that are that good don't just fall off the age cliff like that, but it is going to be a slow, steady march downward, and we're already seeing that. His yards per game have dipped for the last 4 seasons. Last year was the fewest yards per game he's had since 2017. And I know the situation last year wasn't great, but I don't think that it's any better this year. Gardner Minshew, Aiden O'Connell, whoever it is, it's not going to be a good offense. And then they've, of course, added Brock Bowers, who's going to take a big chunk of the target share for himself. So I think in best ball, you can still kind of sell me on Davante Adams because he does have those weeks where he can still go for 30 or 40 points. But Davante Adams, assuming he's going to be going somewhere in round 2 in season-long drafts, I'm not going to want him because there's going to be some highs and there's going to be some lows. Those lows are going to be really, really low. And I think there's just a lot of red flags right now. So again, just it comes down to acquisition costs. And when I'm in round 2 and I see Nico Collins and Jalen Waddle and Brandon Ayuk available, I just much prefer those guys to Davante Adams.
Yeah. I've been leaning that way. I think I didn't think about it enough in May or so. But over the last couple of months, I've definitely leaned that way. And I'm taking a guy like Jalen Waddle over Davante Adams, for instance, and not really feeling super, super bad about it, just given the situation. Las Vegas is going to also run at a pretty slow pace, more than likely, and not run a ton of plays and be pretty run heavy, or at least try to. And that defense isn't that bad either. I don't think that it's necessarily that they're going to be in these ultra negative game scripts. So that's bad for fantasy football all around. So I like that call out of Davante Adams. Man, this was great to chop it up, have you on Perspectives. We've obviously done plenty of shows together, but it was great to have you on here. For anyone not following your work, can you let everyone know where they can find you?
Yeah, real simple. You can just follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. If you like a heavy dose of sarcasm and memes and jokes, you'll find all that there. But if you want to find all of my actual content where I take some nuanced approaches to fantasy football, you can find all that over at Football Guys, writing articles. I got the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show that I'm doing with Alfredo Brown. We're doing 3 episodes a week right now. We'll be ramping that up soon. I've also got a Best Ball live stream that we're doing on that same YouTube channel on Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern. But really just follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge, and I promote and share all the content that I'm putting out.
Yeah, you're a great account, despite people not understanding and seeing the sarcasm, throughout the years. It's always hilarious.
There was one just the other day that blew my mind. I don't know if you saw this one, JJ. I tweeted out. I said, I was looking historically for undersized, unathletic, day 3 running backs who did nothing in their rookie season to see who could break out in year 2 to find this year's Kyron Williams.
Right.
And every single reply was like earnestly saying like, oh, it could be Eric Ray. It could be.
Yeah.
And like not one person understood that I was just making a joke about what an outlier of a season Kyron Williams had. It's humor is tough out here on Twitter.
Yeah, I feel you. I can be sarcastic too. And I have the problem of then when people don't understand the sarcasm, I always feel the urge to respond to them and be like, hey, I'm being sarcastic. And then it just gets so out of hand. Yeah. It just gets so out of hand. Anyway, you can find all my stuff over on lateround.com. Make sure you're checking out the late round draft guide. There's an underdog promo, as you guys know. Take a look at that, lateround.com. But otherwise, everyone, enjoy your weekend. And thank you for tuning in.